My name is Jyoti Puri, and I'm professor of sociology and also the Hazel Leonard Chair. And it's my pleasure to be facilitating a seminar this semester. The topic or the thematic for us is public-facing scholarship. And so it's going to be really pleasure to hear from 4 of our seminar participants. These are faculty at Simmons, 3 of whom are going to be presenting their work, and 1 will be actually moderating the panel. I'm going to introduce them very briefly and then place the full bios in the chat box. And before I do that, I also would invite you to check out the HDL website so you can get a sense of the range of projects and what other faculty participants have been working on this semester. Okay, so having said that, I would like to briefly introduce our panelists, and I'm just looking for, yes. So our panel moderator this morning is Dr. Suzanne Leonard, who is the director of the graduate program in Gender and Cultural Studies. Our presenters are Dr. Hugo Kamya, professor and associate director, Center for Innovation in Clinical Social Work. Dr. Lydia Ogden, associate professor and director of CICSW, School of Social Work. And finally, Dr. Naresh Agarwal, professor and director of Information Science and Tech Concentration, School of Library and Information Sciences. So I'm going to place their full bios into the chat box. And also, before I turn the program over to Dr. Suzanne Leonard, I really want to take a moment and thank Ivy Waikwa for all her work and support this semester. She couldn't be here with us. Hopefully, this will communicate to her somehow, and also to the provost's office that has been just really supporting and assisting throughout the process. So with that, Suzanne, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jyoti, and thanks to all of you for being here and joining us on this, I know, very busy Friday morning at the end of the term. What we are going to do is I'm first going to allow each of our presenters to give about a 10-minute overview of their projects. And then I'm going to ask some more pointed questions about the opportunities and challenges of public-facing work. And as Jyoti mentioned, I just want to express my gratitude really to Jyoti and to Ivy and to all of my fellow participants. It has been such a joy to talk to you about your projects, to get a chance to, work together to sort of brainstorm and improve our writing and our thinking. And I've been saying this to my friends and family that I don't think I've had this opportunity since graduate school, to be honest, to have a room full of scholars looking, at my work solely, and then having the chance to do the same for my colleagues. So it's just been a joy and a pleasure, and I'm just really grateful for that opportunity. So I'm just going to go in order of the presentation of the flyer, and so we'll start with you, Hugo, talking about exploring immigrant stories.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Jyoti, and my colleagues. It's nice to be able to do this, have this opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. And so my work, really, the title of my project is Exploring Immigrant Stories, Being, Belonging, Longing, Surviving, and Thriving. And I say a whole lot more. This project really delves into stories and themes of race, fear, pain, resilience, survival, and success, among others. I see this project as an exploration of how individuals construct their narratives. I took this specifically from the fact that we are all shaped by our stories. And I find myself really at the intersection of many of them. These stories define who I am and where I fit in. They're also interwoven or woven together by the threads of others and encompassing stories of home, of identity, belonging, and longing. I also see them as about connections and encounters. So this project really examines stories that span across individuals, places, and time, and seeking to explore themes of perseverance, of survival, of thriving, and how people navigate issues of hope, courage, and the will to live. So I bring together several aspects of who I am: a teacher, a therapist, a social worker, a psychologist, a student of theology, a spiritual seeker, an immigrant, a father, a husband, a brother, a son, and a lot more. And through all of these, I'm telling stories. They are my stories, stories I tell, and stories that have also been told about me. There are also stories through which I seek to find my voice. So really in this project, I aspire at hearing other people's stories and explorations of personal journeys. Whether this happens in the most revered places of academia, explorations of personal journeys, or if or in the voice of the cab driver who once served on the cardiology department in his home country, or the barber who listens to the stories of men struggling in their relationships, or the student who has to work 3 jobs to send remittances to his extended family back home, or the son who has to translate his mother's most intimate details so she can get the medical attention she needs. I see these as all important stories that need to be told. And I see them really speaking about surviving, thriving, and belonging. So this project really covers quite a bit. And this is what I hope we can hear more about as we go through this discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And now we'll turn to you, Lydia.
Thank you. And just to echo what everybody else has said, thank you, Joy T. Thank you to all of my colleagues who've been in this group. It's really been a special experience in the world of academia. Oddly enough, we don't get to share our scholarship as often as you might imagine. So my project starts with the concept of stigma and ends with, or is delivered at a point of a community where that stigma is not there. So as most of the people here probably know, we can think of stigma as a negative stereotype, societal prejudice attached to a particular characteristic, trait, or identity that often leads to discrimination and marginalization of individuals or groups who are associated with that characteristic. And in fact, our current sociological understanding of stigma, which came from Goffman, it came from Goffman's studying people with serious mental illness. And to define serious mental illness, we can think of that as a broad category of mental health disorders characterized by severe impairment in one or more areas of human functioning, such as thought processes, emotions, or behavior. And they carry heavy names like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, formerly manic depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, names that are made heavy by the stigma that they carry, and the associated discrimination and marginalization that comes along with it. In the US, at least in the white culture of the United States, older adults with serious mental illnesses face an additional stigma, a stigma within a stigma, as aging is also stigmatized in that cultural group, in that dominant cultural group. So people with serious mental illness, and particularly older adults with serious mental illness, because of their diagnoses and symptoms, they face discrimination across systems and in the community, discrimination that leads to isolation, increased physical morbidity, and early mortality. And life courses for people with serious mental illness are often marked by what we call in academia downward socioeconomic drift, meaning that they often end up in the lowest socioeconomic groups in lives that are marked by poverty or even living below poverty. Work in the life course is often intermittent or not accessible at all. Careers, if they have them, are interrupted, ended early, prematurely. People with serious mental illness often experience being cut off from their families of origin, siblings, parents never spoken to again, and or they never establish families or lose the families they've created. And then when it comes to treatment, often treatments with medications can cause debilitating side effects. Treatment can sometimes involve enforced, what's sometimes termed in the psychiatric survivors movement as incarceration, so forced hospitalizations. But these are just the grimmest facts about serious mental illness and not the whole story. And I worked with this population as a social worker, and I've been studying this population in my career as an academic. And I've been interested in how people with serious mental illnesses maintain hope, how they understand and tell the story of their lives, and how they experience resilience despite the challenges they've faced. Often, this is done through individual level recovery, so tapping inwards on their own personal strengths. Sometimes it's also, for the lucky ones, done with the support of resilient families, who, I should add, as families are often isolated and stigmatized by having a mentally ill member, which is a whole other story in itself. So then one starts to imagine, what if there was a place where people with serious mental illness, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of my tea here, where they come in, and when they walk in, they leave that stigma at the door. What if there's a place where they are not only able, but asked to contribute meaningfully to the best of their ability, where they can afford a daily lunch and get support for housing if needed, but also where they can find friends who won't think it's so odd that they've heard voices, or who will be quick to forgive when symptoms get the best of them and they act oddly for a few days or weeks, or maybe even disappear for a month or several months. And it turns out that such places exist, and they're called psychosocial clubhouses, and they're the best kept secret in recovery from serious mental illness, as they occur or operate outside traditional mental health care, the traditional mental health care system. So a psychosocial clubhouse is a community-based mental health program designed to provide rehabilitation and opportunities for individuals with mental illness through socialization, skill building, and participation in meaningful activities within a supportive environment. The intervention in a clubhouse is the community. It's belonging and inclusion, and it's opportunities for connection with others and for meaningful work and activities. So I became interested in clubhouses through my research. When I worked in the mental health world as a social worker, I really didn't know much about them. I became particularly interested in one clubhouse in Massachusetts in the last few years where over a third of its active membership are older adults. And I wanted to understand what a culture that promoted inclusion and belonging for this otherwise stigmatized and isolated population looked like and what it felt like. So I began an ethnographic study where I'm collecting narratives from the older adult Clubhouse members to understand what their lives were like before and after the Clubhouse, and to gather their perspective on the on how the Clubhouse contributed to the after picture for them, and how they think inclusion and belonging happened, how it what the process of it was in the Clubhouse, and how they think it helped. And then I'm also, in addition to the narrative, spending time. I spend a couple days a week at least in this Clubhouse, contributing, as they know I'm a researcher, but I spend my time there as if I'm a member, trying to understand and feel for myself what it's like. So by collecting narratives, I'm hoping to humanize the population in the work, in what's in the cultural dialogue and discourse about people with serious mental illness, and especially older adults with serious mental illness. And by understanding the community where they're accepted and experience recovery, I intend to help people understand that there is hope for this population, and serious mental illness is not the end of a person's story. Most of my research on this population has been siloed in academia up to this point. And so to really fight stigma and fight for inclusion, I found that I needed to move my research outside of academia and to do something more public facing. So I have two public facing projects for this research project. One is to create a website that includes narratives and the overarching story of the community of this Clubhouse. And the other is to write a non-academic book that documents the same. So that's the project that I've been working on.
Thank you so much, Lydia. And now we'll turn to Naresh.
Thank you, Lydia, and thank you, Suzanne. So I have picked a topic which I think has been going on forever in human minds and will probably go on forever. And it's called it's a word that you may have heard of sometimes or wondered about, and I'm sure it's happiness. And in the last 10, 15, 20 years or so, it's also become overused. And sometimes people are accused of not being happy, or as if there's something wrong with that. So it's a difficult topic to write on. And so the way it started was that around 2010 or so, I started doing talks for my students at the usually after the course evaluations are done, and in the very last 20 minutes or 30 minutes before the students are about to leave for the semester, I give them a surprise talk on happiness. And what happened was that that met with a profound impact on students. Like sometimes I'd had students who were crying in class, and sometimes I'd had feedback saying that why wasn't this talk done earlier on in the semester? And I didn't do that early on because I didn't want it to be confused with the subject matter of why the students registered for the classes. So because those could be technology classes or information science theories or knowledge management, any of the other classes. But it was topics which all of us grapple about, but don't really talk about it as much. And there were certain lessons which I'd learned over time, and any of our lessons are nothing but mental models, are ways to look at the world, because the world is what it is, right? The difficulties we go through and the circumstances we face, those cannot be preconceived. A lot of the times situations come and then we just have to handle them. But there could be a certain outlook in which the way we look at situations, if we look at them in a certain manner, that it could be helpful. And I thought that and I had to pick a very fine line between trying to be prescriptive versus trying to be non-prescriptive. And I think what I've tried to do as a balance right now is I write something and then I reject it. So in the sense that what I say is that this is what I've said, but it will not work for you all the time. It will not work. You must know when to reject what I'm saying. And that's because people need to figure out the answers to the questions for themselves. No person can give anybody the answer, even if we've had words of wisdom forever, right? But even then, our lives are different and our circumstances are different. So, so then we need to find our own answers. It's just that what I'm sharing is the answers that I've received over time. Like I'll share a small insight that I got that I just had recently. So one was like I was thinking of two words. One is getting, and the other is giving, right? So it's trying to get something from life. It could be getting love, affection, promotion, job, recognition, validation, anything, right? And it could be giving, giving or contributing to life, recognizing the gifts that we have, that we are born with, and trying to see our lives as one of giving and one of contributing, one of making a difference, but one of trying to be useful in any simple way. So what I was thinking at that moment was that at any points in time, we can be in a giving mode or a getting mode. And so what I said was that if you ever find yourself sad or unhappy for whatever reason, check if you are in the giving mode or the getting mode. And what I noticed was that when we are in a giving mode or trying to contribute in some way or trying to be useful, then we are often not sad or unhappy. The unhappiness comes when we wanted something and we think we should get something and we're not getting that. And so at that moment, and it's okay to be in that, but it's a recognition of that, okay, I'm here, I'm sad and miserable because I'm wanting to get something, and I have these big gifts, and I can be, I can be doing things right now. I can get up and I can take a shower and show up for things. And even if some things are not in my control, there are some other things that are in my control to change. So, so that being in that giving or getting mode also gave me some answers to some questions that Buddha had, like centuries ago, when he's said that the world is full of suffering and suffering is caused by human desire, and the renunciation of desire is what is a way we can get rid of suffering. So I always grappled with that because a lot of religions talk about giving up desire, and then thought that what is the meaning of life if we don't have desire? And if we give up desire, then if giving up desire is a way to be happy, then that's a big price to pay. So, but then I got some sort of an insight into that when I thought that what desire does to you, in a way, having a desire is not wrong. This propels us to work. It propels us to work towards something. But basing our happiness on the outcome of the desire is the problem. When you're saying that my desire must be fulfilled by hook or by crook, and when we start doing that, then we make a lot of mistakes. If we say that, okay, fine, whatever I'm desiring, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, if it doesn't happen, then that's fine. That's like being open to life and being open to experiences. But if you say that my desire must be fulfilled at whatever cost, then we start being selfish. We don't really care about the other people that we're trying to extract that outcome of the desire from, and what kind of stresses that we might be putting in the world. But basically, what desire does is that, or having that blind, sort of like that sort of a feeling, saying that my desire must be fulfilled at whatever cost. What that does is that we are putting a focus on something that's not there in our lives, rather than looking at things that are there. And when we put a focus on something that's not there, that's same as looking at what a neighbor has, or what a friend is, what somebody else has. So then we are looking at those aspects of a life where we are seeing a lack, or where we're trying to create a lack, because we will always have some things working for us and some things not working for us. But we are putting a focus at that point heavily on things that we do not have. And that is what makes us miserable, rather than trying to see the things that we have and see what we can do with them. So that puts us in the contributing mode or the giving mode, versus the fulfillment of the desire. That one is the getting mode. If we get it, that's not a problem. If we're getting things what we desire, that's fine. But most of the time we become miserable because we're not getting what we desire, and that is the moment that makes us not so happy at that point. So just having an awareness of that, and what sorts of games our minds might be playing with us, and knowing that a mind is there to spin stories for us by either going to the past or the future, and if we can bring our mind back to the awareness of the present moment, because that's the only gift that we have, can bring about some insight to us as to how to deal with things when we're going through difficult times. So yeah, those are some of the thoughts that I've been writing about right now. So I taught a course to undergraduates at Simmons last year in the spring called Happiness and Leadership. And that was a very interesting course. So it was trying to develop this into a 14-week course across the semester. And now, so I've been doing this book, and thanks to the Jyoti for organizing this fellowship, so I was able to make some progress on that early on I think in 2020 or something. And now I was able to make some more progress on it. So it's not my primary research area. I do research area in human information behavior and knowledge management, but this is something that I'm passionate about. So I think right now I'm not thinking about how it will show up. I've included topics like the toxicity of happiness and all in it right now. But hopefully once it gets done, maybe it'll be useful to people, maybe it'll not be, I don't know. But so I'm not really thinking about the public facing aspect of it. I'm just thinking of it as putting my thoughts out there for now, and then seeing whatever shape it takes on its own. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Naresh. I hope this is okay with my panelists. I'm going to depart slightly from the first question I gave you, because some of you answered it and some of you, I want to follow up a little bit more on this question of the public facing. But as you were all talking, I realized you're all talking about stories, right? Hugo, your project directly deals with hearing and taking sort of other people's stories and trying to give voice, right, to oftentimes the stories we don't hear, right? And I would say, Lydia, in many ways, you're doing the same, right? You're doing ethnographic work, and like again, telling the stories that don't get told. And Naresh, I was thinking one of the last things you said is that the mind is there to spin stories for us. So I guess I'm wondering for each of you, to what extent do you see yourself as a conduit for other people's stories? And how does that affect how you approach your research? Or how much does this also have to do with your own story? Because I think that's just something that struck me as a bit of a through line here, particularly with you, Hugo, and you, Lydia, because you're directly talking about kind of other people's stories. So I apologize for the last minute curveball, but I just thought it might be a fun thing to explore together as a group.
So Hugo, you want to go first? Yeah.
What did you say, Naresh?
No, I was just saying, Hugo, you could go first.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Maybe since I didn't specifically talk about how this really connects to either my work, or I think your question now does also carve in that. I guess for me, I drew this inspiration from the work of Peabody Award-winning journalist Michelle Norris, particularly her book on Our Hidden Conversations, which explores what Americans think about race and identity. Her work motivated me to pose similar questions to immigrants about their own perceptions and experiences. I wanted to understand how they view themselves and how others perceive them, examining their stories of, again, as I said, being, belonging, and longing, surviving, and thriving. And as an extension of my own story, I sent out a prompt to what I called the Immigrant Project, asking individuals to share their stories in 6 words, just as Michelle Norris had done. And I received numerous responses to that prompt. And the prompt actually intrigued me from the start. Even as I was reading her book, I found myself captivated by the responses she received, particularly from immigrants contemplating what it means for them to navigate their immigrant identity. And this was very close to me as an immigrant myself. While Norris's book or focus was primarily on race and identity, my interest in immigration led me to delve deeper into the immigrant experience and their perceptions of self-understanding. So to your point, Suzanne, I've always been interested in these issues. What intrigued me about reading her book was the simplicity of the prompt she used, which garnered significant interest. And I've long been fascinated by these topics. I've written and done research on African immigrant populations, I've also worked very closely with these populations here in Boston and in the greater Boston area, most recently examining social and cultural wealth or capital of African immigrants and how this social and cultural wealth contributes to educational outcomes. So to your point, stories of home have deeply connected me to my own roots, shaping my identity and sense of belonging. Growing up, my parents used storytelling to convey important values, traditions, and cultural heritage. And these stories instilled in me wisdom and helped me to see myself as a product of my culture and upbringing. So, yeah, stories hold a profound significance that is sometimes underestimated, especially in today's digital world. They have influenced my journey, and I seek to learn more on how they are influencing other people's journeys. We are storytellers, and as Maya Angelou says, there's no greater agony than a story that remains untold. So that is an impetus to all of us to keep telling our stories in whatever version that is. Yeah.
Lydia, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So you had asked if we saw ourselves as a conduit for these stories and sort of how our own stories intersected with what we're talking about. So two really good questions. I think to the first one, I would say, yes, I do to a certain extent see myself as a conduit for these stories, and which are really not told elsewhere, and see in being a conduit for these stories, part of the responsibility is to reduce sort of an objectification of the population, where sometimes people will be interested in stories of serious mental illness because of the unusual things or bizarreness that can come along with serious mental illness. And so, like, when I use the word humanizing, I'm thinking of, the things that are relatable in their stories and the things that we could all imagine experiencing, both in terms of the hardships as well as the things that would lift us up and promote our resilience. In terms of the way my own story intersects, it's such a big question, because I became interested through my work in the field as a social worker, and I worked in housing, which is a really interesting role. I was in this housing for people. It was kind of complicated. It was mixed tenancy housing, but a lot of people have been homeless and have a serious mental illness additionally. And when you're in housing, you're kind of living your 8 hours a day alongside your alongside the tenants of the housing. So you sort of co-experience their lives with them. And so and in the role as a social worker, you might even be going out to help people grocery shop or clothes shop or advocate for them at a doctor's appointment or with Social Security. So you really sort of live your life next to them for a certain number of hours a day. And so that's how my story first intersected with this population, and especially became concerned having gone to medical appointments with older adults with serious mental illness who either they weren't being taken seriously sometimes, or there was a sense of sort of hopelessness or dismissiveness I felt towards the population and their attitudes. This didn't happen with me, but I had a colleague who went to visit a older adult who had schizophrenia, and he was a double amputee with his legs. And when she got there, he defecated in the bed, in the hospital bed, and it had been hours and nobody was coming to clean him. So that's one of the more dramatic stories, but I felt like sort of symbolically what was happening to people in the medical system. If you come in and you say you have schizophrenia, it's immediately discrediting of a lot of other concerns that you might have that don't have easy answers. So that's sort of how my story started. And then, of course, as a researcher, and over time, there's sort of different ways that I've connected. My dissertation advisor said this, and it's very true, but I did a narrative project for my dissertation, collecting and analyzing life history narratives of older adults with schizophrenia spectrum disorders. And she said, these people will live inside of you. And that's really true too. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I do have a question for you, Naresh, that sort of piggybacks off this, but if you want to jump in before I ask it, feel free.
Yeah, I think what I feel is that our human life, the primary thing in our life is all about human connection, because while we are individuals, we are connected individuals in the sense that other people shape us and we shape other people. So we don't exist completely individually. So our individuality is sort of as part of a connectedness that we have. And so the stories that we have either as individuals are typically, even if we call it my story, it is the story of other people connected to me. And even if we call it other people's stories, they're stories of we connected with them in some ways and other people connected with them. So there is this whole set of connectedness in them. So when I started doing this book on happiness, the initial part, it was typically abstract concepts, but then people don't connect with abstract concepts. People connect with stories. And so that is why, so you need to bring in stories to justify that. And what I'm beginning to do now is I'm working on a chapter called Living Happiness, the Author's Inner Journey, where I talk about, and it starts with like, every bird has a song to sing, and we need to have the choice to sing that song. And so it is primarily trying to think about childhood upbringing or influences along the way that led to my own journey of happiness. And then I realized that it's not just sometimes you learn from your own experiences, but you also learn from the experiences of other people who are close to you or from their stories along the way. And they all shape you and they influence you in profound ways to have insights about different things in life. And I write here that any documentation of an inner journey is just a snapshot, selective references that fail to address the full myriad of thoughts, emotions, reflections, and experiences that fill each moment of a day of our lives. Like waves in a sea, these thoughts, emotions, and experiences come in varieties, ranging from the positive to the negative, from the sublime to the mundane, from the selfless to the self-absorbing, which makes it difficult to distill any lasting conclusion from them. And any such exercise is one of simply using a lens, a perspective to view a multidimensional reality. And we often tend to choose perspectives that comfort us and those that conform to our biases and worldviews. So I think in any exercise that we do, there is the story, and I bring about the story of my grandparents and my grandmother growing in Sikkim in India in the late in the early 80s, and it was cold evenings, and there was always a bonfire, a small fire, which we call Angithi in India, and it was a coal fire, and people would typically come and sit around over there, and there would be tea and oranges that we'd put on the fire to heat them before eating them, before peeling them and eating. So, and that I realized that sitting around the fire with my grandmother was a natural way in which I learned a lot of my big lessons in life, because people would come about and it was an open space where people could just walk. People didn't have to take appointments or dates to meet people. And there was a lot of storytelling every single day in those conversations by sitting around the fire. And last year, like I think or a year before that, I did a book on 25 stories of students who went from India to Singapore to study engineering and then went on to find the ikigai, or the reason for being in life. And I'm also involved in another project where I interview people to know about their stories. So I think learning of, and in this project, right, with Hugo's and Lydia's and all of us, this is such a great initiative that we have, the group that we have, where we're learning so many of our stories. And what I find it fascinating is that on the one hand, we look at departments and schools and all that Simmons has, and we think we have siloed research areas and all that. But as soon as we come in a group like this, we find so much of interconnectedness. And there is, we don't really think, I don't think any of us really belong to different schools or different areas as such. We are just all connected, interconnected people. And and it's just that we have given names to them to think of them as discrete, but they're all connected. So thank you.
Thank you, Naresh. You sort of stole my thunder there, because I was about to say something sort of similar, which is that it strikes me as really interesting as we're thinking about public space facing scholarship, that we keep coming back to this need for this connective tissue, right? And how different that is than the way we usually think of scholarship, because we think of scholarship as so personal and sort of connected to our individual goals. In some ways, to the getting, as you said, Naresh, right? Like, I need to get tenure, or I need to get a promotion, or I need to get a raise, right? And we think of our scholarship as something that we kind of, that gives us things, right? And so it strikes me, and I love your heuristic here, because so much of what all of you are talking about is the giving, right? Is sort of using your scholarship to sort of give to the larger community, again, these stories that don't often get told. And I love your point there, Naresh, too, about the way in which we think we're doing such different things, but we're, you know, especially as we're thinking about public facing scholarship, I think there's a lot of commonalities. So I want to just ask a question about the greatest challenge of doing this kind of work. And and like you, Naresh, I have, in my most recent work, I'm writing a book called The Feminist Guide to Marriage, and I've been telling a lot of stories, right? But thinking about the ethics of that, you know, sort of telling other people's stories through my own lens, you know, with my authorship. And it strikes me, you know, Hugo and Lydia, you have kind of a distinct advantage in this arena, because you've spent your whole lives working with people, thinking about their stories, thinking about how to tell their stories. So I was going to ask a question about challenges, but now I'm going to ask a question about tips. So what sort of tips do any of you have really for this act of kind of using storytelling to do public facing scholarship? And I'm asking this purely selfishly, but hopefully will be a benefit to others.
Well, I'll start because I don't have tips. This is actually new for me. And that what I was excited about with the Hazel Dick Leonard Fellowship was this opportunity to sort of think, what do I want to do? How can I bring my work outside of academia, and what does that look like? And I had been thinking about this anyway, but it's, you know, I've got to say, I'm aware that it's not very buzzy to talk about older adults with serious mental illness. There's something that doesn't quite catch the public imagination. And so that's one part of it that I think is a challenge, is how to make this matter to other people outside of people who are already invested in serious mental illness or already concerned with health systems. And actually, the piece that I find the most challenging as I'm thinking about the website and the book is the use of self. So thinking about, you know, I think you need well, let me go back to say in academia, and in social work writing, there's very sort of specific formats and ways that you describe yourself in a peer-reviewed article, and how you have or have not influenced the research. And my sense in having read sort of other academic writing in the public arena is that the use of self is different, and there's more of an expectation of transparency and discussion of how you are involved and how your background influences what you see and creates the story that you're telling. And so first of all, it feels vulnerable to be doing that. I can't hide behind the conventions. And the second part is how to get the balance right between being a transparent and trustworthy narrator and also not centering myself in the story. So as I describe my experience of being in the clubhouse, for example, one of the things I realized early on was that it was going to benefit me to go to the clubhouse. And so thinking about like how much of that story will help people understand how a clubhouse creates inclusion and belonging, and how much of that is just like for my own benefit to be writing about it. So I was thinking about that balance. So I haven't answered your question, but that's sort of, maybe there's something in there about, you know, what we have to figure out in public facing scholarship that I'm grappling with.
Really appreciate that, Lydia. Thank you. You said so many smart things. Naresh or Hugo, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, Hugo, you want to add first?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Again, I don't know whether these are tips, but I'll attempt to think about some of the things that have been helpful to guide me through this. I have attempted in doing this. I've been trained as a narrative practitioner, and I think a lot about the importance of seeing complexity in the simplicity and simplicity in the complexity. So going back and forth around that. I also like to see sometimes exoticizing the domestic as well as domesticizing the exotic. It's also another thing that I think about as I see it with people. And to your question, earlier question, how do we see the public in the private and the private in the public? So going back and forth between those, also including this whole idea of witnessing and expanding the audience. And with that, also owning my own positionality in storytelling, socially locating myself in the stories that as I explore people's stories. And in so doing, I also like to think about how I prioritize intentional action of this exploration, ensuring accountability, self-accountability, holding myself accountable, and also staying open to change. That maybe there is not a story that is out there that I'm seeking, but that stories evolve, and as they evolve, we catch them or they catch us too. So those are the things that come to mind at the moment.
Thank you, Hugo. I was struck by your use of complexity and simplicity and simplicity and complexity, because when I look at my life and my approach to life, it's all about that. In terms of even when I wrote my tenure packet, like in 2014, I think I had written all about a series of yin yangs, which is all about seeing the quantitative and qualitative and qualitative and quantitative, or seeing the theory in the data that you gather and seeing the data in the again seeing the small details when you're looking at the big picture, or seeing the leaf in the woods, or seeing the woods in the leaf, right? So it's all about so I could look at it as a dialectical way of thinking, like synthesizing contradictions, and so it's not being satisfied with any one point of view. At any one point of view, you look at the counter point of view, and in the other side, you look at this side. So that's interesting to me. And to Suzanne's earlier question on tips for stories, or the difficulties in writing about other people's stories in your work, and I find that very difficult as well. So even when I'm writing things in my book, right? Let's say I'm introducing, if I say my brother, it's not so interesting. If I add a name to it, it's more interesting. But then when you add a name, does the question of permission come in? Or is it all right? Should you change the name, or should you keep the name the same? And when you do things, when you add other people, what I realize is the choice of words is really important, because even though you might have gone through difficult times in difficult circumstances, it takes on a whole different meaning when you put it out there in print or with other people, because now that is construed in different ways, and that might have an impact on the people that you're mentioning in your stories. So I typically try to soften the blow in some senses, like I try to do a soft landing in terms of, even if the events were difficult, so that it doesn't have an impact on the characters that you mentioned. And while still saying what you have to say, but trying to protect people who you're mentioning in some ways. And that's my approach. Like, even when I do interviews of people, I typically send it to them, and I ask them that if there's anything that they've said which you think that I should remove, which might have an impact on them, on their career or their relationships. So it's a choice between putting things out there versus making sure that people are protected, and it's a difficult choice. So I think that's where the question of consent comes in. So as long as where you can see consent and when people are okay with it, then that's fine. But I know that's very different from journalism, where you really try to get people to say what they said and not giving them a chance to, again, correct it after they've said what they've said. So it's not easy, I think, having these answers to the questions, but I do realize the choice of words is the most important thing when you're writing, or no matter anything. The specific choices of words that we use can determine how we say what we're saying, even though the content might be the same.
And I want to add to something Naresh has said. I do something similar with we call it member checking and qualitative research, but always checking in with any story that I'm going to share, as well as sort of my analysis and the themes. And what I found that's really been interesting is, even when I feel nervous about, okay, I'm going to read back about a time when this person tried to kill himself, for example, that they feel gratified that that part of their story is being told. So even though I'm maybe uncomfortable with it, they feel like this is an important part of my life, and this is good that this story is being told. And a study that I haven't done is, but I other people have, and I'd like to do it too, is to understand the well-being benefits for having your story, for being able to tell your story and have it told. Because people in my research, my participants have always said that, it really helped me to be able to talk and to talk with you about my story. But I haven't done the measures of that. But yeah, so just adding on what you said, Naresh.
Yeah, and Lydia, one more point that you just mentioned about death, right? So in the chapter that I was writing on the inner journey, I wrote a disclaimer in the beginning saying that this chapter mentions death and loss as well. So you can skip the whole chapter or specific portions if you don't feel comfortable. So again, as a reader, I was worried about the reader as well, because even though I've written it in a way, it's not like difficult, but you don't know how somebody takes it. So I think that was also another difficulty that I felt, not just from the people whose stories I mentioned, but also from the reader's perspective. And Hugo, yeah.
All right, sorry. I just wanted to add one thing. One of the things I also find fascinating, and I also deal with in my writing and exploration, is looking at metaphors, because I see metaphors as important pieces in the storytelling. Is that just like stories, they mask something, and at the same time they reveal something. So I like to think about what is being masked and what is being revealed, what is being spoken and what's not being spoken in the in the storytelling.
That's really interesting, Hugo. I think what I was saying as choice of words, and you're saying it as metaphor in a much more beautiful manner. And I think it's that is what it is. I think it's all about deciding how much you want to reveal and how much you want to mask. Right? And that's why the metaphor you choose might have a big impact on that. And usually the masking, I think what I tend to do is more to protect people than about not revealing.
Thank you, Hugo. Your aphorisms, I'm writing them all down, seeing simplicity and complexity, complexity and simplicity, and what's being vast and what's being revealed. Thank you. Thank you all. And this conversation, your point, Naresh, about thinking about your reader, actually tees up my final question, which is the one question I actually gave you already. So there should be some comfort in that. And it was the question about sort of your imagined audience. And really the question is sort of what communities or constituencies would you most like to affect with these projects? So another way of thinking of it is, who do you most want to reach with the work that you're doing right now?
Hugo, you want to go first? Or Lydia?
I'll say something briefly, which is that, I'm really hoping that I could have sort of a general audience. There's very few books that come from social work, sociology, psychology seem to have. It feels like a big ambition. I don't know if that will come to fruition, but that's my goal, is to really move this from academia and to a bigger audience where that's where the stigma and discrimination live, as well as in academia, of course. So that's my goal, or my ambition, but we'll see. TBD if this happens.
Hugo?
Well, yes, I got that question, and I was thinking that my goal for the readers is really to gain a deep understanding of immigrants' experiences by delving into their own narratives of identity and belonging. And I hope that these stories resonate with the readers, evoking feelings of connection, longing, resilience, and empowerment too. And ultimately, I'm hoping that I aim for both immigrants and readers to embrace their stories and find empowerment in sharing and owning their own narratives, that their struggles need to be acknowledged and their triumphs need to be celebrated, for that matter. So as I said earlier on, and as I think about this, it's really the projects is really to unearth stories others tell about us as immigrants. And I think that stories can build healing spaces to explore issues of power and powerlessness. They communicate certain truth, and I believe that a project like this, or in a project like this, my plan is really to explore the stories that immigrants tell or have been told about them, and that they begin to surface. So I'm hoping a subtext to this is to explore stories of power and powerlessness, asking questions about who tells the story, what story gets told, and what sanctions it, or who sanctions it. And so drawing in a way from story and story metaphor, there's the word again, I think I'll explore how stories communicate certain truths, or even untruths for that matter. I hope to interrogate and examine embedded messages in these stories using what I like to call a decolonial and anti-colonial lens as part of this project, which, by the way, is part of a book contract with Norton. And again, I've been pushing back to see how I deliver it so that it's not the publisher's idea or thinking. Because in some ways, this project is part memoir and part an act of resistance. And I think about questions that I, as an immigrant, have faced. So I'm also going to bring in some poetry because people ask about questions about my name, questions about how you pronounce your name, questions about whether you have plans to go back, questions, is it really you who said what you said? Is it really me who's saying what I'm saying right here? Is it really whose ideas are those, questions that will often ignore you, even as you have asked the question, questions where you belong, how you belong, and whence you belong, for that matter. Yes, even in academia, questions about your credentials, about your productivity, your research, your accent, your speaking, exoticizing your speaking or familiarizing your speaking. So all kinds of questions that are part of people's experience, questions that leave you out and questions that invite you to knock you down. So my hope is that this project reaches out to immigrants who live in the margins and in the commons to find their voices and reclaim those voices as they navigate a sea of whiteness.
Thank you, Hugo. That was so beautiful, and thank you. Yeah, thank you for doing the work that you do. Suzanne, you have things to add?
Thank you. That was wonderful, Hugo. I did want to open this up to the audience if there are any questions that the audience might have for our panelists about
Yeah,
public-facing work.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that audience part that you asked, Suzanne, from my book. So I've written something on this. So what I wrote is that how do we define happiness when there is profound inequality? What do we do when happiness is not an individual issue, but an outcome of social conditions? So this is a book by a relatively privileged person who has had various successes over the years, steady long-term employment, and a support network of family and friends. And I'm writing for people who might be going through their own challenges. Whether it will work for you in your unique set of current circumstances, privileges, or lack thereof, you'll need to judge. Everybody has different challenges and privileges at any given point in time and space, which other people with privilege may not understand or understand fully. So I think so in that case, I'm writing for people who are going through challenges, but then I do not claim to understand what those challenges are.
You.
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, we could go to audience questions now.
Kyle, nice to see you.
Hi everyone. Thank you to all our presenters. I'm Kyle. I use he, him pronouns. I'm one of Suzanne's students in the GCS program. I actually have a question for Lydia if she's comfortable answering. So something that I've been focused on for a little bit now is intentional language related to this stigma that you described. So what I mean by that is people in my life will use mental illness diagnoses when they don't mean to use that word. So for example, they'll be like, I feel really OCD about this when they're trying to organize something or color code something, or even myself, I'll use language like, oh, the traffic was crazy on the way here. And I don't mean it was crazy. I mean, it was unsurprisingly busy or the drivers were ridiculous. So my question for you is, do you think that this helps kind of take away from the stigma when we use intentional language? And if so, how does that like help us? Sorry, what I actually mean is, do you think there's something else that I could do in my everyday life that would be more beneficial? Or do you think using intentional language is something I can implement in my everyday life to kind of help with this?
Yes, I do think language matters. Those are really good examples. I have a good friend who has OCD, and she always says, I wish I was OCD in the way people say they're OCD when they're saying, oh, I'm so OCD. Like, it's made them so neat and organized, whereas for me, it just like puts holes in my life, So I think language matters. I like ridiculous, wild. Although I will say in the clubhouse, people say crazy all the time, So, and, or about each other or a circumstance. And then in terms of other ways to address stigma towards people with mental illness, I think a lot has actually happened, especially since the pandemic, that there's been somewhat of a normalization or more of a normalization of having a therapist, seeking treatment. That's been talked about more widely. There was an understanding that the pandemic was bad for everybody's mental health. And in fact, not to go into too much of a tangent, but I had in one of my interviews for this project, one of the people said, that stay at home and isolate instruction that everybody got meant that everybody got to experience what it was like to have a serious mental illness, to just be home alone and have nowhere to go. So I think that that there has been progress made as people have been more open and talking about it. And I think that, ordinary people talking about their ordinary mental health challenges, and actually what's called, in contrast to serious mental illness, we call it common mental illnesses like anxiety, mild depression. I think that actually, I'm hopeful that that will have a really positive impact on how people with more serious mental illnesses are seen and accepted. And then I guess the final thing that I would say is to, being thoughtful in how we talk about and include people to the extent that we can when we know that they have had mental health struggles. Is that helpful, Kyle? Okay,
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing all that.
thank you.
Anyone else from the audience want to ask a question or make a comment? Yeah, Jeffrey.
Good morning. Great to see everybody and hear everyone. Thank you so much for sharing about your work. Jeffrey Steen, assistant professor in the School of Social Work and also one of the fellows this year. It's really been a delight to engage together to share our work. And something that I often think about is what to do with what I'm learning, right? And certainly sort of thinking through and reflecting and engaging is essential. And I also then struggle with the piece of what actions like do I take in my daily life to best allow what I'm living, allow what I'm learning to affect how I'm living. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Jeff, what was the question in the end?
Sure. Yeah. So the question is, as you're engaging with your work, how is it impacting the way that you're living your life, I guess?
I think that question is, I don't see a work-life separation as also, so I'm not one of those people who's very good with separating work and life, because I think I see life as work and work as life in some ways. And so the kind of scholarship or work that I've been doing, and I think in some ways I'm lucky that my research area is human interaction with information, and everything is information. So pretty much, so for instance, I was able to observe my daughter when she was between the ages of 2 to 4.5 years, to see her using an iPad, and then write a book chapter on a child's use of the iPad, of electronic devices. So then where do I see a separation between life and work over there in some ways, right? It's kind of a mix of both. So, and also I do research in serendipity, and there, when in serendipity, you really need or information encountering by chance, when you're not finding information, when you're not really looking for it. And in one of the works that I'm doing currently with Professor Sander Erdeles, and we did a project on that with a student, was that how we have this big focus on productivity. And in a world that has a big focus on productivity, there is not really room for serendipity. And serendipity is very, very important where to have creative endeavors, because to have a space for creativity, right, we need to have times when we're not doing something actively, or when we're not doing something very focused on a task. We need to be doing other things. We need to be doing things where we are supposedly apparently distracted and not being very productive. But those are the things which actually make a big difference in the long run, where we end up doing good work and important work. So recognizing that in workspaces is important, that we need to allow room for people to be looking for, to have room where serendipitous encounters can happen more and more. And how many managers recognize that and reward that in workspaces? And that was one of the surveys and like a research study that we did. But I think it's important. So I'm really grateful for this project, because I think it's allowing for a lot of room for serendipity and fertile thoughts to just come in from different directions. And to create a climate like that, I think an environment like that, I think we all feel privileged in some ways, because it's a rare thing to happen. I think we don't see this in academia or any other workspace very often. So kudos to Jyoti for that, for facilitating this and recognizing, facilitating that, and for all of us, I think for all of you in participating and bringing so much in different ways.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. For me, as I think about that, is how much my story is an extension of other people's stories, just as their stories are extension of my own stories. So, so thinking about complexities of immigrant experiences, you know, I hear so a great appreciation of people's experiences, separation from loved ones, from possessions, from familiar environments, cultures, resettling in new lands, and being disconnected from their social networks in their countries of origin, seeking new connections to different norms and values, and also dealing with losses, whether those are losses that have to do with familiar environments, language, social support systems, belief systems. I think about this and think about psychological, social, and spiritual rootlessness that people may go through. And then the piece to your question, as I was thinking when you did ask, is that these stories are not easy to tell, but they are people's stories, and they need to be told, they need to be witnessed. And so for me, I see that that's perhaps even the getting back to Suzanne's question, also the public facing question about the witnessing aspect of it, because they provide ways, people defining moments in people's lives. Yeah, anyway.
I love this question, Jeffrey. I was actually joking with my family that, like, with every life choice I make, I become a little bit less relatable to others. So, I'm now spending 2 or 3 days a week in a clubhouse for people with serious mental illness, where, most people don't even know what that is. And yet it's this sort of centerpiece of my life now, and a place where I find belonging. So it's, so I guess part of how it affects my life is as I said, in housing, I sort of co-experience their lives, and to a certain extent, I co-experience a little bit of the marginalization too, where you do what with who? So a lot of having to explain, and some people will be quite interested, and other people will sort of glaze over and slowly back away. So it's an interesting thing to think about.
Lydia, I just sort of want to sort of not challenge, but say the word that actually keeps striking me when you all are talking about your work is that this has helped you to further refine a certain ethic of living, right? Like the way you want to kind of ethically live in the world. And it strikes me that all of these projects are helping you all to further refine and hone that ethic. So it may be making you less relatable, but I certainly see it as contouring, a life in a way that really puts these values of social justice at the forefront, right? And thinking about who lives on the margins of society. So it may make you less relatable, but I think it makes all of you, frankly, incredibly admirable. And I love that question too, Jeffrey, because I agree, like we don't separate these things in the way we live our lives. But I like to think, especially with these public facing projects, that they're helping us to, live in a way that feels more authentic kind of to our values and our beliefs. And hopefully some of the work can help us to get closer to, as we're all in this sort of journey of structuring those things. So thanks for that question.
And I think one of the things I'd like to add is that I think as we get, when we're growing up, right, maybe in our teens and early 20s and all, we are conforming a lot to other people a lot of the times, people's expectations of us. And by the time we start crossing mid-30s and 40s and going into 50s, and as we get older, right, we realize that it doesn't really matter too much to conform to other people's expectations at that. And so it gives us permission to live more authentically. And we all are trying to create meanings from our lives in the work that we do, right? So you feel more free to do more, to work that is more meaningful to us. So Lydia, to your point about even if other people think of it as whether they agree with what we're doing or not, it doesn't really matter too much after a point. And because you want to do things that you want to do. And so one of the things which I like to think is that don't stop shining just because other people think that you're shining too bright. Right.
I wanted to add, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Hugo. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like the term you used, Suzanne, an ethic of living. When I teach my students, I actually talk about an ethic of care, because we talk a lot about ethics and the do's and the don'ts. And I think when we stay in the do's and the don'ts, we all know that you don't sleep with your client, you don't sleep with your student, but those do's and don'ts very I mean, they remain at codes. And so I actually challenge my students, and to your point is that how can we develop an ethic of care? So I like the ethic of living, because that really pushes us to think about social justice, to think about social change, to think about human rights, to think about the complexity of these things, our attitude, which is far much more more important in this than the do's and the don'ts, which is remain at a code level of, and so you can always say you don't put your feet on the ground, or like in Catholic school, that they have to make sure that in the dorm you had both feet on the ground. What's that? What if you have only one foot? And so, to your point, ethic of living, I like that.
No, but what is the ethic of care, Hugo? Like, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the ethic of care is for many of us who are in social workers, in psychotherapists, therapists, we talk a lot about moving away from technique to attitude. Rather than actually the technique is going to be important, but also how we deliver that technique, how we are in the interactions with the people we work with is far more important than just the technique. We can have all the book knowledge that we want to, that has to do with the ethical codes and everything else. But if we don't really position ourselves in ways that think much more broadly about our attitude on how we are with clients, our ethics of caring, and what which brings in issues of intentionality, accountability, noticing resourcefulness, and that it's not I, as you said, giving it to them, but I'm also getting in the process. All of that really builds around our ethic of care, our how we think about caring or living much more broadly than just the manualized ways of doing ABC.
Thank you, Hugo.
I wonder if I can chime in unless any of our other participants have any. Okay. So much of this conversation resonates so deeply. I'm working on a book project right now, which is around migration or immigration and death rights. And I really have, long described this as a project which is a labor of love at this point. And so much of what has been talked about, I think about it as telling sociological stories. And so part of the thing that I'm wondering if you would reflect on, and Suzanne, to you as well, if you want to chime in here, is that even as we tell these stories, we are somehow working within the influence of our disciplines. And I don't mean that in a narrow way. You're doing interdisciplinary work, but that, Hugo, how you were saying, that your work is informed by this ethics of care, which is very much about clinical practice and social work and allied fields, so that our disciplines, our training in those ways are continually shaping us, and sometimes we're responding to that. So the question that I really, I've been sitting with and would love to hear from all of you is, given the purpose, given what we are trying to achieve, the audiences that we are trying to speak to, how does that influence the very form in which we tell the stories, right? How does the mode of delivery, the form of it, how does that how do we change that? How does that need to align with the purpose? So again, Hugo, just made me think about it. So if the purpose is to move other people, to connect other people, to get them to think about their own immigrant stories, is there a way for them, for you as the sort of the facilitator, to provide an avenue for them to tell their stories, right? So how are you all thinking about the purpose and the form?
It's interesting. I was last month, I was at the University of Virginia, and I ran into an anthropologist who has done some work in Uganda. And she has written this book, Having People Having Heart. China, she's the Dean of Students at UVA. And as she was talking to me about her work, I said, oh my goodness, that is really, and she uses, to Lydia's point, ethnographic sort of reports in talking about these experiences of people in Uganda, and how they are interfacing with charities and interdependence and all that kind of stuff. And I said, I could sit with this person and feel really I'm at home with them, and around the work that they are doing, that I think there is that interdisciplinary aspect of what we are talking about here is so crucial. And I think it sort of behooves us to really enter into a very humble participation with others who are doing similar work, and checking to see how we might use their experiences to build on our work, or to expand the audience for that matter. So, to your point, I think for me, even as you talk about the book you're writing yourself, I'm saying, oh my goodness, I like to hear how you go about it. And maybe there are some tentacles and some ways we can be shaking hands about what it is that you're doing. When you talk about happiness, I said, yeah, of course, who doesn't want to be happy in all of this? And when Kyle asked Lydia the question about the use of language, I talk about this in languages, and how and of course, with that comes also the power of questions, and how language is used in one way or another to communicate. So, interesting question. And maybe I'm not even answering it, but it's food for thought. So thank you again for posing that question, Jyoti.
No, and I'd just like to add that I think And I've thought a lot about in terms of what is the best way to get to people in terms of what is the mode of communication that's most effective, right? And so I think there's no single mode that will work. It has to be multiple modes in multiple ways and in times and spaces that work with people. So what this does is, I think the book is one avenue, but I think the book becomes a catalyst in some ways, in the sense that it's the communication in the book itself is not enough, but it sparks conversations. Like for instance, right, what's happening today right now is something that we may not be writing in our books, but this conversation, that sparking of the conversation is, I think, it allows us, it gives us some credibility in people's eyes to think that, okay, this person might have something to tell us, and to that extent, they might want to listen to us, and I think that's a value in it. And I think English is also limiting in some ways, because I think about languages, and stories might have to be told in the languages that people speak, and also in the word choice of words again that is like most accessible to them. So it has to be about the ways in which people make sense of information. And in the social media, I find that Instagram Reels, I feel, are such an effective way in which people are able to convey messages within a minute, within 60 seconds, something, and people choose a choice of music and whatever appeals to them to convey the message. So I think there is a lot of technology as well, which can help us convey messages, but the book gives us a starting point to put everything down.
And I would just build on both Naresh and Hugo have said, in that in terms of using language, thinking, and as I'm working on this public facing piece for the first time, really thinking about how I can write rather than in an academic style, in a more colloquial vernacular, in a way that's accessible and sort of less formal. So that's been sort of interesting part of the project for me, and it's been freeing and fun, and I feel allows me to be more creative if I want to achieve that bigger purpose of reaching a wider audience.
And Lydia, to add to that, I just realized how much more productive you can be, if I use the term productive, in terms of having to, when you have to write more, when you're free to write, versus looking
Yes.
for a reference for every single line that you write.
Yes, totally.
Thank you so much. I realize we are 2 minutes past time, and I really appreciate those of you who have been able to stay with us this entire time. So I just want to profusely thank our panelists, and again, Jyoti. And this has just been such a productive conversation. I hope it was useful for those who joined us. Thanks, Nicole, for your comment. It's so wonderful. So obviously, please feel free to reach out to any of us with further questions and conversations. Clearly, these issues are all very close to our hearts. So thank you so much again, everyone, and have a good Friday and a good end of the term.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.